שותפים, זה נסגר. אתה יכול לחזור לשלך. זהו, התחלנו?
שנייה? Okay, good afternoon to everybody. We'd like to start on time. Therefore, I'm going to start only 4.5 minutes late. The microphone. I don't need the microphone. Okay. I'd like to welcome you to the afternoon session of the 52nd Annual Conference of the Israel Society for the Promotion of Classical Studies. The first afternoon session is devoted to Jews and Jewish writing in the Roman Empire, sponsored by the Minerva Center for the Relations between Israel and Aram in Biblical Times. There are two schools of thought regarding the chair and calling people up to lecture. One school of thought is to give a background. The other school of thought is to give no background at all and not to waste time speaking. I believe in the second school of thought. Therefore, without further ado, you came to hear the lecturers and not me. Therefore, without further ado, I give you Yaakov Dolgopolsky-Geva from the Open University of Israel, who will speak about military and civilians in the Jerusalem Akra between first Maccabees and Josephus. Floor is yours. Thanks.
This is the best presentation I've ever seen. Okay, thank you. This one? Okay. So I'm Yaakov Dolgopolsky-Geva. In 168 or 67 BCE, the Seleucids fortified an area in Jerusalem south of the temple, and in the words of first Maccabees, it became a citadel for them. Manetho, Autois Eis, Akra. Fortifications of that area, known in modern scholarship by its Greek designation Akra or Haggai, seem to have been identified by Doron Ben-Ami and Yael 10 years ago in the Givati parking lot south of the Temple Mount, seeing a decades-long debate regarding its exact location. The Akra has a brief and tumultuous history, known mainly from two sources: the near contemporary First Book of Maccabees, and dependent upon it, the much later works of Josephus, many antiquity. This history consists largely of conflicts with the Hasmoneans, including several attempts to evacuate it, usually failing due to Seleucid intervention. The first reported attempts to evacuate Akra were made by Judas Maccabeus in 164 to 162 BCE. Following the Seleucid reconquest of Jerusalem, the Akra was refortified in 160 or 159 BCE. After the Hasmonean Seleucid reconciliation in 152 BCE and the establishment of permanent Hasmonean rule in Jerusalem thereafter, the Hasmoneans made a few attempts to evacuate the Akra. However, the complicated relations with the Seleucids prevented them from fulfilling that goal. Finally, in 141 BCE, it was achieved. Following a cruel siege, the starving residents of the Akra surrendered and were then expelled in the 23rd of Yael, a date that would become a national festival in Judea. In this lecture, I focus on the military component in the Akra descriptions and the tension between it and the non-military components in First Maccabees and in Josephus. Reading about the Akra in First Maccabees, we notice tension between its description as military, fortified compound, and its description as an urban district populated by civilians. I will clarify this. Greek term Akra means citadel. The establishment of Akra is described in First Maccabees 133 as a fortification of an urban area and turning it into an Akra. Moreover, time and time again, First Maccabees reports of attacks on the Akra and sieges laid on it by the Hasmoneans. As opposed to these military elements, First Maccabees rarely uses military terminology for the residents of the Akra. Those are usually described simply as people from the Akra, Ektes Akras, or other designations implying nothing except their connection to that place, or in just indicating that they are not Jews, a description deemed by modern scholarship inaccurate. The author of First Maccabees uses distinct military terminology quite often. Dunamis military force is a term uses dozens of times. So is Bambole. the army. These are only examples. The regular non-military terminology regarding the Akra residence is therefore worth a discussion. There are two exceptions, two verses in which First Maccabees describes army forces, in the Akra, in the Seleucid Shabbat attack in 231 and in 952, following Maccabees' victory and the Seleucid reconquest of Jerusalem, when the Seleucids are reported to have stationed army forces in the Akra. There are two cases in which First Maccabees mentions active military functions of the Akra. In 135, weapons are stored in it, and in 953, Judean nobles are imprisoned there, to be released in 1009, following Dimitri's peace letter to John. Josephus' accounts on the Akra are somewhat different. He often mentions a royal garrison in the Akra, where First Maccabees describes nothing of that sort. Occasionally, Josephus also identifies this garrison as Macedonian and explicitly attributes its placement to the Seleucids. For example, in 1 Maccabees 6:26, describing a delegation to the Seleucid king during the siege of the Akra in 163 or 62 BCE, the Akra people warned the king about the rebels. Behold, they are about to capture the Akra in Jerusalem today. This is how Josephus holds that delegation. Now there is danger that Judas and those with him might seize the Akra and the guards stationed there by the king. Another example is found in the parallel descriptions of the siege laid on the Akra by Jonathan circa 145 BCE. Where First Maccabees mentions simply the Akra in Jerusalem, Josephus writes the Akra in Jerusalem, where there is a Macedonian garrison. Another case is found in the parallel account of the Akra's fall in 141 BCE. First Maccabees writes about Simon's expulsion of the Akra residents simply, he expelled them from there. Josephus, in War 150, writes, he captured the Akra garrison. And there are a few more examples. The terms that Josephus uses for this garrison are almost exclusively plural garrison and plural gods. So the information about it is taken solely from Josephus. In modern scholarship, the permanent stay of this foreign Seleucid garrison in the Jerusalem Akra, apparently all through the 26 tumultuous years of its existence, is practically unquestioned, despite of several difficulties it raises. Mostly, it is hard to explain how the Akra garrison would survive in Jerusalem during the periods of Hasmonean control of the city, occasionally between 164 and 160 BCE, and continuously from 152 BCE onward. This is especially difficult to imagine how it maintained its loyalty to the Seleucids during the three periods of reported Hasmonean sieges on the Akra, in 163-62 BCE, circa 145 BCE, and the final siege in which the citadel was subdued in 141 BCE. How did the mercenaries receive their salaries during the siege? It was suggested that the Akra garrison was also responsible for collecting taxes for the Seleucid government, and if indeed this was the case, the Akra garrison was able to support itself financially. However, during the siege, that ability was also lost. Would mercenary force have remained loyal to the Seleucids in such conditions, and would it have surrendered only after its men began to starve? Secondly, if the Seleucid garrison was stationed in the Akra from 168-67 BCE to 141 BCE, including at the time of its fall, First Maccabees' silence on the matter is puzzling. If the author of this work never missing an opportunity to condemn the Akra residents and their actions, failed to mention that among them were mercenaries of the Seleucid king. Moreover, would he miss the opportunity to describe those soldiers among the surrenders of 23rd of Yael? It is better to assume that he reported what he knew about the Akra residents, and since he and his audience knew who the people were who left in 141 BCE, he could not really exaggerate much in his account. These problems with the common portrayal of the Akra garrison justify a critical re-evaluation of Josephus' descriptions on which it depends. How did that picture actually emerge? There is no indication that Josephus had any reliable source about the history of the Akra other than First Maccabees. Maccabees speculated that Nicolaus of Damascus is the source for some Josephus information about the Akra, but there is no evidence of that. It must be noted that Nicolaus could not be much more knowledgeable about the Akra than Josephus himself, having written around the early 1st century CE. Nicolaus was still some 150 years apart from 141 BC. If this is not a source from which Josephus derived his information about the Akra garrison, I suggest that it is from Josephus' interpretation of 1st Maccabees that this picture has sprung. There are two reasons to argue that. First, as mentioned, within 1st Maccabees, tension exists between the military and non-military aspects of the Akra, resulting mainly from the non-military terminology applied to Akra residents. The repeated mentions of the Akra garrison make Josephus' account of the Akra somewhat smoother, and there is the terminology used by Josephus. Terms for run and for garrison and guards were not used by Josephus only for his Akra descriptions. Interestingly, used them in antiquities in quite a few occasions when rewriting historical descriptions, adding to them intentions not mentioned in the sources before him. For example, rewriting Judges 3, where the biblical author writes about the judge of Yael, and Yahweh delivered Kushan-Rishatayim, the king of Aram, to his hand. Josephus has, first, therefore, he destroyed Husavsat's garrison, running through Husavsat that was in front of it. In Chronicles, Josephus found his note about the enemies the Lord assisted King Uzziah against, and against the Arabs dwelling in Ubad. He wished to expand and henceforth he encamped against the Arabs who were close to Egypt, the city on the Red Sea, and placed in it a garrison. And there are a few more examples. This all suggests that in adding a garrison to his Akra descriptions, Josephus worked more as an exegete than as a historian. He did not rely on any additional source for it. Rather, he added it to his descriptions in an attempt to harmonize a difficult source. This is true. The historicity of the Akra garrison ought to be critically assessed. What I wish to do in the last part of my lecture is propose an alternative solution to the combination of military and non-military elements in the Akra description of the 1st Maccabees, thus also reconstructing a somewhat different history of that so-called Citadel, based solely on 1st Maccabees account. For that, we must first revisit a few details in 1st Maccabees. As mentioned, there are only two occasions where 1st Maccabees mentions military forces, dynamis, in the Akra, in 231 and in 952. In addition, twice 1st Maccabees reports active military functions of the defunct. So when weapons in the Akra is mentioned in 135, right after the description of its establishment. Second, holding hostages in the Akra is reported right after the second mention of the dynamis in 953. What is common to all these occasions is that they happen in periods in which the Seleucids ruled Jerusalem. For the Hasmonean first takeover of the city in 164 BC, and during the Seleucids' renewed rule in it in 159 through 152 BC. Reading 1st Maccabees alone, the only thing military about the Akra in the period of Hasmonean rule in Jerusalem is being besieged. It's mentioned 3 times. How the defense of the Akra during these sieges was carried is not specified in 1st Maccabees. Standing a siege is an entirely defensive military task, and though in principle it is not an easy one, 1st Maccabees does not suggest in any way that the people of the Akra performed it effectively. In 163-62 BCE, the Seleucid attack on Bethsur forced the Hasmoneans to lift the Akra siege. Circa 145 BCE, it was apparently Seleucid diplomatic pressure that lifted the siege. The third siege was successful and ended in the expulsion of the Akra residents. To sum this up, the mere fact that it was besieged is not evidence for the presence of a standing professional military force in the Akra. It could be no more than a local militia that was trying successfully or not to defend it. What all the details suggest is that the Seleucid garrison did not stay in the Akra through all the years of its existence, but only during the periods when the Seleucids ruled Jerusalem. In the periods of Hasmonean rule, it was only the civilian population that inhabited the Akra. perhaps including a local protective militia. To conclude, this is the new reconstruction of the Akra's history, I suggest. It was founded by the Seleucids in 168-67 BCE as a military stronghold, housing alongside its civilian population a garrison of mercenaries. Together with its fortifications, this function is what gave the Akra its name, but that function was not retained through the 26 years history of the compound. It is difficult to know to what extent the Seleucids were able to maintain the Akra garrison in the stormy years 164 to 160 BC. But after the recapture of Jerusalem in 159 BCE, they restationed it. After the Hasmonean final takeover of Jerusalem in 152 BCE, it was only the civilian population and perhaps local protective militia that remained in the Akra. These, non-Earths, were starved by the Hasmoneans in 141 BCE. These non-Earths are the sons of the Akra, Haggai, Tanit's grove, who marched out of it in 23rd of Iyar of that year. The garrison of the mercenaries was not there.
Thank you very much for really sticking to the time and giving us an extra 5 minutes per question. So there are actually 15 minutes per question, and therefore, if
I was to read that.
that's fine, David.
Thank you so much. This is a very refreshing view, and I wonder what does it say, in your opinion, about the dimensions and the location of this feature?
What the location of the Akra?
Yeah.
I think it is both from the explicit mentions of its location, according to both Maccabees, if I remember correctly, and definitely Josephus, by the fact that it is sometimes parallel with the city of David, and from the fact that in the Septuagint, indications the city of David is sometimes nicknamed the Akra. All these suggest that the location is south of the temple, and most likely the place that Dolan Benami and the Yam Chichanovitz found in the Gibati Park. And if it is not exactly that spot, still has to be that right? It has to be. The only I think the only so-called source that makes it difficult is kind of something that looks like a folk legend that appears in Josephus, describing what happened to the Akra after its destruction. And according to that legend, I don't remember right now where exactly it appears. According to that legend, the hill itself was taken apart by the Hasmoneans, and thus creating a new situation in which no place in Jerusalem is higher than the Temple Mount. So this is obviously a folk legend, or probably written by someone who hasn't been to Jerusalem for a while. So, because like so many spots in Jerusalem, including Jerusalem, that are higher than the Temple Mount. So this, I think this legend caused many unnecessary controversies, and obviously it has nothing to do with the reality of the Akra.
Safrir has a footnote in his article on Cathedra on the Akra where he takes apart that legend. He's not even willing to put it in the text. He puts it in a footnote at the bottom and says that we don't have to really pay any attention to what you see. Says. Before, I'm going to take advantage of my position and make a quick comment. What you said is really radical. Right? If you look at as long as we're located right now, as long as we're located in the Akra and Chotiotir and Chanyon Givati, or what used to be, that this will imply something a little bigger and stronger than what you're hinting at. And I therefore wonder, if we look at Megillat Ta'anit to make such a big festival, theoretically, over something that was really a minor garrison and not all that important, which was repopulated by this and that.
I don't think it's. I don't see it this way. I think.
Obviously.
Yeah, I think if my construction is right, means that there is that the story of the Akra is the story of fortified neighborhood that changed its Hellenistic character for the first 10 years of Hasmonean permanent rule in Jerusalem. And there was that moment in which they were able to finally kick those bastards out. This is like this is a big thing. It's not and if a big thing is that they expelled garrison, why doesn't it say anywhere that they expelled the garrison except for Josephus? Oh,
I'll grant you the point. Professor Sheps, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Professor Sheps.
I think it gives a very good argument. The one that I was not convinced by was the statement that you couldn't imagine how they could remain there for 11 years during the Hasmonean domination. Israel maintained a garrison on Maccabees for 19 years during the Jordanian occupation. The British had maintained Calais, still maintained Gibraltar. There are places where, when you are not actively at war with the other side, it's not worth going to war over this one place. And you could easily have the garrison remain there. After all, it's a period of reconciliation. They recognize the overlordship of the facility, and it seems it's possible to make, but that particular argument.
No, I agree that this is that it is a bit not impossible, but it does raise a difficulty. There is something. This is one of the difficult things about the way the Akra garrison is described in modern scholarship.
Obviously, there's something there that they wanted to get rid of, and they didn't for 11 years, and then they did.
Regret that. Yes.
What we are actually comparing here, and one of the main problems, the comparing two that text are both politically motivated, both near, both books of Maccabees and Josephus, and you can see also about the heroical research to study in the service becomes only when they are facing not before nor after. And the problem is also from other emotions that we have about spirit is that the Haggai is actually a symbol that the Hashmoneans were not independent until the death of Yaakov at around 129. All we want to believe that after the revolt or during the revolt they got an independence, it's only such a fact that those are trying to learn, and not only this mentioned but throughout. They not very good at covering if you are looking at the outside, because they are all the time do the Russell children to completely elusive royalty, or I would say not royalty exactly, but Aristotle. Are playing the game inside an empire that is too strong to lead. Only the Dolgopolsky-Geva allows them to gain more than autonomy, but actually independence. And this is why they are only loyalists. Also, most of the Jews were pro-solution. The Hashmoneans, at least in most cases, were unable to get most of the system, even the local Jews, let alone the rest of the empire. And when we are saying Macedonians, we need to question what does that mean, because in some of the texts, even Josephus mentioned there are Jews. I just don't remember which one. And Macedonia is just a second country, a southern ethnicon, or in terms of different Hellenistic military levels, around what is called Gone or military settlers. And it's possible also they had family members, and then you can rely on the locals and not necessarily only to the soldiers themselves. And they could also be Jews that came from some other place as loyal Jews instead of the local ones, and by cases by some of the others. And there's so many options you cannot know in those two texts exactly what it is. But they are certainly not mercenaries, because garrisons and also settlers were never mercenaries. Any of the main empire.
Short question.
This is that last comment is very important.
You have anything to?
No, I don't have any. I don't have any good reply. I don't want to answer those questions.
Okay.
Especially the last comment.
We still have time for questions, Barnea, and we're going.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much. My question is, I'm making an assumption, and then I'm going to have a comment because of the earlier comment. The historicity of Maccabees 1, you seem to find more accurate than Josephus, who was using journalistic license to make things flow. Am I that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful to me because I'm working in comparing other things. I just want to comment, as an archaeologist and someone who's tracking this, that the wrong and honest approach is not just in the Givati parking lot, and by the way, I actually was parked in cars when it was a parking lot, but it's also the other side of the hill and explaining what was found many decades before, and it's partially preserved as the other side of those fortifications in Area G, and it would go down the hill somewhat. And there were earlier opinions of the Fisher, of course, and many others who moved the Akra much further up, closer to the Temple Mount. And this is before the Herodian extension to the south that the Ritmar shows where the difference is on the scene. So it's some distance till you get to the Hasmonean extension of the Temple Mount, and this may even predate back. So there's some distance between there and the temple, and they talk about the ability to shoot somebody in the Mizbeach. People shows that some of the towers, they could easily have placed some of their weapons, which were catapults that could reach hundreds of meters away. So my suggestion, Yael Silverstein is working on this in Tel Aviv University, specifically on that. My suggestion is that it's the bottom of the hill to some degree, and it's this area on both sides of the hill, and ignore the old city walls and went even further up. So it's really covering a large area. It would be able to have reservoirs, it would be able to have food storage, and as the chefs pointed out, you can negotiate things. It's not that they were locked in like Masada, they could deal with things over the years. It's very reasonable that they could last for so long, dealing with not just a small area. That's my suggestion.
One more question?
Yeah, exactly. Yael Silverstein, you're probably familiar with our PhD. She fulfilled this recently in the Tel Aviv University, emphasizing and focusing on the polyarchetics of the Hellenistic, mainly Akra, and especially on the Haggai. It would be a more mature and finalized, I think, solution to look at as to the remains, the physical ones, by the archaeologists. They are not as impressive as in other areas, in the other Hellenistic arena, okay, I would say. And I've debated it and spoke several times with Yael, more or less, I think, agreed upon it. I might have a solution that I've offered. Yael would be exactly the things that you've offered to intermediate between the citadel and the living quarters. This is not a big contradiction. I think you hinted over this. If you will call it an acropolis, and there is a hill. And when we say acropolis, it's not necessarily the acropolis and a lower city, not whatsoever. So there is a hill there, and there's actually some remains perhaps of a Diatekizma, sectioning their fortifications within it, which will resolve all the issues. And as Barnea said, I'm actually more favor in the descriptive accuracy of the Josephus values. We're talking about merely 4 generations only, a priesthood from Jerusalem. He knows the place much better than the very vague sometimes descriptions in the Maccabees. It's very fast, we can speak about it later. the physical remains that we have from the very segmental archaeological excavations there give us the best option for today. They are so segmental that we don't have actually any wall. We have the glacier, which is a very odd, existing, but very radical solution for fortifying as part of the Hellenistic polyarchaetic.
I want to, I think this can be a sort of an answer to the last two comments, and I think this is something that we need to remember, and I will clarify this about my argument. I don't claim that the Akra was not established as a military or at least a semi-military compound. This is why it has its name. I grew up in Haifa, and we have we have a religious section called the checkpoint. Because in the 1940s, the British Army stationed a checkpoint there, and we still call it the checkpoint. 2024. So the fact that the compound was established the way it was established, and therefore includes all the military functions that it needs, does not mean it retained its character as a military compound for 26 years, including 11 years of permanent Hasmonean rule of the city. This is my point.
We're going to stop at that because my point is we've reached our half an hour. Wow. This has really been fascinating, and I learned a lot about the Akra. If I was still teaching, I'd be happy to include this in my teaching. I look forward to reading what's written in more formal places. Publish this. You have, sorry for not seeing it. If you haven't yet, send me up. Thank you very much. Our next lecturer is Yael Escojido, and she will lecture on the case of the khmάλωτοι in Manetho's account.
I hope that you are more patient on the French accents. Yeah.
If they can stomach my New York accent, French is fun.
Non, c'est pas ça.
את מדברת אליי?
Il était où tout à l'heure? Just a moment so that we can share it. Celui-là. Et comment je fais comme ça? Attends, une seconde, comme ça. Attends, on va voir comment ça marche. זה לא זז, השקופיות לא זזות בזום, אתה יודע למה? בזום הם לא רואים שמפה מזיזים, הם לא רואים בזום שזה זז. זה נשאר על השקופית הראשונה. On est obligé de sortir. מישהו בזום יכול לאשר שזה זז? אתם יכולים לפתוח רמקול להגיד לנו שזה עובד?
כרגע זה לא עובד.
רגע, בוא נראה אם יש עוד הודעה פשוט.
סטפני, רואים את הכותרת. אבל לא ברור אם זה זז.
נמשיך בוואטסאפ. אז זהו, mais attends, mais comment je fais maintenant? Là, tu te mets là. Ah non, mais attends, mais si je suis là, je peux pas être là. Et si je fais ça comme ça marche pas? C'est ça? Oh là là. Comme ça, il faut rester là. Comme ça, il faut faire. Ah, alors attends, on va faire ça. Non, ça, c'est ça. Ah, attends, et ça marche pas. Et ça fait comment? On met ici ou là-bas? Avec la raison, comment je fais? Comme ça? Je fais comme ça. Alors attends, et si je... Okay. So the case of the Achmalatoi in the Hyksos account of Manetho. זה עובד עכשיו? ככה? פה?
לא, בדיוק הפוך.
פה?
ימינה, בדיוק. לא פליטה.
ככה? טוב, אוקיי. In his seminal work on the Jews in the Roman Empire, Jean Justel enumerates 22 slanderous anti-Jewish statements derived from Greek and Roman sources. One of these cases, the Jews are the people condemned to slavery. In this paper, I will demonstrate that the account transmitted in the name of Manetho, the Hellenistic Egyptian priest and contemporary of the two first Ptolemies, was the first Greek source to suggest enslavement as a characteristic of the Jewish nation. Manetho wrote an historical chronology beginning with the earliest dynasties that ruled Egypt, including the people known as the Hyksos. According to Josephus' Contra Apionem, one source where Manetho's writings are preserved, the Hyksos were very, very violent people who conquered the ancient Egypt, destroyed the temple, and treated the Egyptians with cruelty. In the text of Josephus, they are also identified as the ancestor of the Jews. Now, the terminology Jews or Jewish people is not mentioned, not at all, in the text of Manetho about the Hyksos. But the identification between the Hyksos and the ancestor of the Jews is actually this verse. This verse is quoted by Josephus as transmitted in the name of Manetho, and the verse says that after the Hyksos have been expelled from Egypt, they built the city of Jerusalem. And now it's widely accepted by scholars that when the author of the verse wrote this verse, he had in mind the Jewish people, even he didn't mention them. Okay. Now, I don't want to enter in the debate about who wrote this verse, this passage, Manetho himself or maybe another interpolator, but I adopt the scholar's position according to which the text transmitted in the name of Manetho is not its original form. I also believe that when Josephus worked on the text of Manetho, he knew the text of Manetho in its original form, and he knew also other interpolations, and he couldn't always distinguish between the interpolations and the original text of Manetho. Now, the text of Manetho gives us some information about the origins and the etymology of the Egyptian word Hyksos. Who were the Hyksos? The text says that Hyksos means, this one, means Basileis Poimenes, kings, shepherds. And according to scholars, this rendering could be a correct rendering because we know that the Hyk in ancient Egyptian language means ruler, Basileus, and the other sound, the sound sos, which has no hieroglyphic form, but it appears in the Coptic language with the meaning of shepherds. So this rendering, Basileus Poimenes, could be a correct etymology of the word Hyksos. However, Josephus told us that in another copy or another book of Manetho, he found that the Egyptian Hyk is not Hyk, but Hak, with like an aspirate. This is what he wrote in the Contra Apionem. Okay, don't understand Hyk, but Hak, with aspirate sound. And he said that the Hyksos were not king shepherds, but rather Achmalotoi shepherds. So he considered the Hyksos as Achmalotoi. Achmalotoi means
prisoners of war. This second etymology, based on the confusion between two words with very, very similar pronunciation, Hik and Hak, is not supported by other papyri or other literal sources concerning the Hyksos. And in my opinion, it's very, very improbable that this word, the title Achmalatoi, was introduced in the text of Manetho by mistake. I believe that the title Achmalatoi was deliberate interpolation made by a native of Egypt, familiar with the language of the Hellenistic rulers. And I also believe that Josephus, even he said that this etymology, the second etymology, is the right one. He said that this is the correct etymology of the word Hyksos. He also believed that this etymology was not in the original form of the text of Manetho, and this is why he said that this etymology is found in another book or another copy of the book of Manetho. Now, combining this conclusion, I mean the conclusion that this is an intentional interpolation, with the accepted view that the text of the Hyksos identified the Hyksos with the ancestors of the Jews, I wish to argue that this terminology, I mean the Achmalatoi etymology, was introduced by an editor who deliberately designated the Jews as Achmalatoi. And now you can see my two first conclusions in this study. The first conclusion is we are talking about intentional interpolation, and the other conclusion is that this interpolation was made to designate the Jews, I mean the inferior status of the Jews, as I will explain right now. For a reader of the Greek culture, the condition of captivity, prisoners of war, indicates a clear connection with slavery. We have a lot of sources connecting the slavery and the captivity. Actually, the slavery is the result of the captivity, and we know the famous quotation of Aristotle, who said that there is like an agreement between people that after the war, the people who have been conquered by the others became actually the property of the others. We also know that the terminology achmalota, captivity, was used by papyri of the Ptolemaic dynasty to designate slaves captured in war. We have the expression achmalota somata, somata, bodies, because the bodies are only bodies, the slaves are only bodies, they have no identification, they are only bodies. So achmalota somata designates the bodies, the slaves who have been captured. And this expression appeared a lot in the papyri from the Hellenistic times. Therefore, for the Egyptian interpolator of the Hyksos account, who knew, and this is a very, very important point, he didn't know only to translate the language, but he knew also the Greek culture and historical text. So it seemed that this interpolation was inserted in order to designate people, in this case, the Hyksos, the ancestor of the Jews, as people who were the property of others, as people who were subordinated to others, so people of inferior stature. Now, my next question in this study was, is there any historical evidence supporting this interpolation? In other words, is there any historical truth behind the idea that Jews lived in Egypt as achmalatoi? The letter of Aristeas, written in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, informs us that after Ptolemy I, in the beginning of the 3rd century, when he conquered Koila, Syria, he also took captive from the land of the Jew and he transported them to Egypt. We also know that according to this letter, the verb achmalotitzen, to take captive, appeared in the royal decree by Ptolemy II, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and guaranteeing the liberation of all Jewish slaves as a precondition for the translation of the Torah into Greek. So that means that according to the letter of Aristeas, we know that the condition of the Jews in Egypt was the achmalotai. They came in Egypt as prisoners of war. Okay, you can see, for example, that this condition, the condition of the Jews as achmalotai in Egypt, is also supported by Josephus, by another source. And the source of the Josephus is not the famous Josephus paraphrase of the letter of Aristeas, but this is another source supporting that the Jews were achmalatoi in the Hellenistic Egypt. We have no doubt about that. Now, my question is now, you remember the text of Manetho talked about the ancient Jews, the one who lived in the ancient Egypt. So why why the text of Manetho used an attribute of the ones who lived in the Hellenistic Egypt to describe the one who lives in the ancient Egypt? You understand me? This is the same attribute in ancient Jews and the Jews in the Hellenistic Egypt. We know that in the Hellenistic culture, past and origins played a very important role in social and cultural life of the communities. Okay? If people for the Greek culture, if people want to prove that they are people of values and high status, they first prove that they are good origins, that they are people of good origins. And this is exactly why Josephus wrote the Contra Apiomen, because he wanted to introduce the Jews to the Romans as people of very high status. So how did he do that? He went back to the origins, to the glorious past of the Jews. Because if you have a glorious past, this glorious past actually has influence on the present of the people. But we also know that this, for the Greek culture, this theory works also with the opposite. I mean, if people have bad origins or slaves origins, that means that today, in the present, in the Hellenistic time, there are also people of inferior status. So, regarding the Egyptian interpolator of the Ixos Akon, in describing the ancestor of the Jews as achmalotoi, he wanted to fabricate Jewish ancestry and origins with the same bad characteristics of the one who lived, and this is an historical fact, who lived in the Hellenistic time. In this way, he informed the reader on the sense of continuity between bad attributes from the past and also bad experience in the present. Actually, in the Hellenistic time, they are the same Jews. They are the same Jews with the same bad origin. This is what the interpolator of the Manetho wanted to show in this interpolation. Now, last question. What are the historical context and circumstances which motivated this interpolation? I invite you to read the answer in the article.
Thank you very much, Yael. And we have lots of time. Questions that are so long, I can't even do the mathematics, right? You have like 10 minutes plus.
10 minutes.
More than that, but I'm not good with numbers. So let's start.
Thank you very much, Yael.
But I must go back to the first sentence of the quotation you showed us, that in Manetho, the Ixos are not necessarily defined as Jews. They built Jerusalem. So I'm not sure I follow the logic. So if they are not necessarily Jews and they are achmalotoi, and perhaps
this is not connection with the Jew. This is what you want.
This is my first comment.
Yes, I understand that.
The other one is that achmalotos, of course, is a captive. war, but not, again, not necessarily a slave. I mean, it is expected that the captives of war will be ransomed if they become forced slaves, but this term kept on being used until very late as for captives, not necessarily for slaves. So I think that perhaps I haven't checked, but perhaps if you would be able to check maybe the TFG or some other database if Manetho or in its fragments and Manetho is used for other people or in what contexts. Okay,
so I understand. First, I understand your first comment, and this is a comment of all the scholars. Is Manetho did he write about the Jews? Yes or no? But no, it's widely accepted that when someone writes Jerusalem in this time, it was the Jerusalem connected with the Jews, and it was not simply a geographical terminology. So it is widely accepted today that the one who wrote this verse had in mind the Jews. But I understand. I understand.
Just
no. I have no problem. I understand your
whatever you're saying now. I think you should stress in your art.
Okay, and the second about the Achmalatoi, we have another source of Manetho using the Achmalatoi on only this one, and we are not sure that he was the one who used that.
Yeah, I know.
But I believe that the one who used that, he knew about the Achmalatoi conditions of the Jews in the Hellenistic time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else? Anybody else? Taking a microphone to someone who wants to ask. Anybody with a question? Going once?
Okay, so maybe I'll ask a quick one. Do you see any continuity in the description of Jews in this time? Because we have, before Manetho, we have also Haggai of Era with similar but not similar accounts. Do you see any continuity?
You mean after Manetho?
Yeah, from Haggai to Manetho and then maybe later.
I think that the calumnies about the natural aptitude of the Jews to be enslaved is from this text. But in the Roman period, for example, this calumny was used a lot by the Romans. Tacitus say that, Appian say that. And I think that the origin of this calumny about the origin of the Jews is the text of Manetho, the interpolated text of Manetho. But this is my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Where is the article of which they're going to?
I will let you know. I have no idea today.
I'd like to invite our third speaker, Haggai Olshanetsky from the University of Warsaw, who will discuss a new look at Jews in the Roman army during the Jewish revolts. Haggai, for
First, it seems that you got a trailer because it was passing throughout the last few minutes, so you got already some of it. And also, it seems I got the hardest spot in the schedule because it was a really tough. It is a tough act to follow. And I also wanted to thank, of course, the organizers, everyone that took part in enabling this event to be. And of course, I'm really always happy to be in this forum and in this university that I've spent so many years in. And I presume that now we should go to the topic itself. And the topic, let's see if I can put it here, it should be easier maybe. And the topic, of course, is the Jews during the revolts. And usually we look at the Jews and the Romans too often through the prism of the Jewish revolts. And maybe sometimes we just get the wrong impression. especially that these three catastrophic events happened in only a span of 70 years, but the Romans controlled most of the Jewish population of antiquity for far longer. And I think that looking at them would enable us to answer many questions regarding both the social status of the Jews in the Roman Empire, in order to understand the Romans, how they treated both Jews and other minorities, and of course, to understand the Jews and Judaism itself. And we must go and look at this topic that almost never is debated, which is those Jews that not only served in the army, but served in those tumultuous 70 years and what happened after. And we have plenty of evidence for Jewish service, and also prior to the Great Jewish Revolt, and that eventually led to the destruction of the temple and many of sometimes bad blood or believed bad blood between the Romans and the Jews. And we of course have the Jewish armies in the form of the armies of vassal kingdoms, like of the Herodian dynasties. And we have also, after the Herodian dynasty and the territories were annexed, and many of those units continue serving the Romans as part of the regular Roman army. Also, we have exemptions for military service from the late Republic, which are a great evidence for Jews serving also as citizens and residents of the empire in the ranks of the regular Roman army, and not only from outside as part of the army of a vassal kingdom. And then we have one of the most important events, or most corroborate testimonies for Jewish service, which question also indeed the present and of Jews inside the Roman army, and that is the recruitment of the year 19 CE. And I noticed I forgot the AD here. I tried to keep the CE at the moment. And this is an event that is corroborated by both Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus, and I'm mentioning only them and not the other testimonies mentioning the event like Dio and others, because they're the only ones that clearly mentioning that those are Jews, and at least Suetonius and Josephus mention also the number 4,000, and the number 4,000 maybe seems not that big, especially in comparison of an army of 300,000, but it is major because they are all coming from a very limited geographical area. They must have been only from a very limited gap range of ages between 18 and 42 at most, because all of the texts mention that those are men of military age. So also the Romans throughout it never done anything outside of the norm. And also, this is not a Jewish legion, but it's most probably an ad hoc force like was common in the Roman period, and it most probably was composed of several cohorts. And at least as we haven't seen any other thing that is new in the connection of this recruitment, that means that also Jewish cohorts were not a new idea, or at least Jewish formation, even in low, if smaller than cohorts. And then we are coming to the question, yes, we have Jewish military service in the Roman army, that there is a lot more debate regarding it, but still is not in the main focus of sometimes academic discourse, and many still are constantly surprised about it. But the Jews serving in the army is even more surprising and less debated, to almost not at all. And we have several evidence, and I'll try to shorten some of them because I wanted to keep actually discussing some of the more major and interesting ones that sometimes are actually outside of the norm or very unique in compared to the others, and we need to also to ask ourselves, what does that mean and how it actually portrays also the other Jews. And so the more normal are like Matthias, that we have evidence from, it is released document from 68 CE, and was found in Stebai, next to Naples, in Italy, and he and three of the people on the documents are from Syrian origins, and his name is one that was often used by Jews as a replacement for the name Matityahu. But we have a much stronger evidence, and also a much, I would say, more interesting, not that he is not interesting, just the debate that we can produce from it, and this is the Josephus stamp bread from Masada. And actually, I think, to say thank you to Avner Eker at the last row, because he showed me or pointed to me the existence of this inscription a few years ago. I had no idea what it was, and of course what it would produce later, but I really need to thank him. And in general, what we are doing, and especially what I'm doing, is actually collecting donations, because it's impossible to read all the literature today, and they are printed way too fast than any of us can, or even together can read it. And this is why we need the help of everyone if it's possible. And this inscription is important and unique, not only because it's one of the few Jewish inscriptions in Latin from the East, but because it was plastered in Masada. And this is most probably came from a bread stamp that was used by the Roman army. But in the original publication, they suggested that this was a Jewish baker that then joined the rebels. However, there are a few problems with such an assumption, or assuming that he was not really part of the military, and also the assumption that he joined the rebels is not necessarily the only one. Because bakers in the Roman army were usually soldiers. They were the soldiers themselves that make food for themselves. A representative of the cotubernium, of the tent, of the basic unit in the Roman army would usually make the bread for his friends, and they would have a rotation between them. And the bread and the stamp was meant to make sure that the weight is right, and maybe also to know who was the baker, but that I'll mention a bit later with a different ostracon that I thought myself when I looked at it this morning on the presentation. We must put it there, and we will get to it in a few minutes. And the other possibilities is first, yes, he could have been a soldier in the Roman army that joined the rebels, but we have a few other options, because I think originally it was not deemed that Jewish presence in the army was that common. The first one is he could have been part of the original garrison of the fortress that was killed by the rebels, and they took the bread stamp. It, of course, could have been Roman soldiers that died in combat or captured by rebels, and then most probably have been killed in any other part of the rebellion. Another option is that he was, why I'm saying one of the rebels may have taken it also, is because maybe his name was exactly like the name of the Roman soldiers that died. And we know that one of the few of the members of the Jewish rebels that took the fortress by force had the name Josephus, and it was suggested that this bread stamp belonged to him. I'm suggesting maybe it was just a souvenir that he liked because the name was the same. Another option is, of course, that he was part of the force that took the fortress from the hand of the rebels. And the plaster that we found could have been actually from an attempt of the Romans to renovate this room. They stopped in the middle. We know that they've done so in few of the rooms in the fortress. And it would be impossible archaeologically to differ between a plaster from the year 75 and the year 66, or especially if the Romans haven't reused the room for the fullest. But what is important for us is that we have, and I see that we have a failure. We move to the next slide. I'll try okay, work? Yes. And so that served during the revolt. Also, we have, of course, the army of Agrippa that is still a vassal kingdom that supplies a lot of Jewish troops to fight also Jewish rebels. And then we have another very famous story, and of course, this is the story of Tiberius Julius Alexander, and I'm sure that many here are familiar with the story. And what is important is that he's one of the most successful Jewish military in history, certainly the most successful Jew in the Roman Empire that we know of. He was the nephew of Philo of Alexandria, and because he was a citizen, and of course because of the ties, he tried his way through the civil service, and then of course the cursus honorum he needed also to serve in the army. He was the governor in Judea in 46 for 2 years. As Appelbaum offered in a recent article in the Journal of Ancient Judaism, that could be actually a good argument for him still connected to his Jewish identity, unlike many that have tried to claim that he most probably forsaken the religion of his forefathers. He later on served as the chief of staff in General Corbulo's campaign in Armenia, and for his good conduct we see him as the governor in Alexandria in the year 66. In that time, of course, we have the Jewish revolt in Judea, but also we have turmoil in Egypt. When I'm saying Egypt, I mean Alexandria. Eventually, because the Jews in the city were not really willing to compromise, he had to crush the Jewish community, his own community. He saved the aristocracy among them, of course, maybe favoring social status of religion, but most probably because they were his family, the friend of his family, the people he knew of, and of course was very important to him to save them, even if he failed to save the rest of the Jewish community. He later helped Vespasian to take power in the empire and became emperor. And then, again, for his good conduct as a loyal man, as an important person, he became the chief of staff of Titus in the campaign of 69 CE. And he, maybe because his father donated also the gold coating of 9 of the gates of the temple, he, like Josephus, according to Josephus, of course, tried to prevent the temple from being destroyed, which again shows that he was connected to his Jewish identity. His last role in his very successful career was as a Praetorian prefect that we know from an inscription. Then we have also a few texts that are not mentioned, usually even as a testimony for Jewish service, and they are really interesting. For example, this one from Dio that says, meanwhile, some of the Romans too, this is from the siege of Jerusalem, too becoming disheartened, as often happens in a protracted siege, and suspecting furthermore that the city was really impregnable, as was commonly reported, went over to the other side. The Jews, even though they were short of food, treated these recruits kindly, in order to be able to show that there were deserters to their side also. And what is interesting is that the phrasing, the text, they don't show that they had a concrete military reason. They were not surrounded by the enemy. They surrounded the enemy. And as we see, there are other differences. And it is really hard to find any comparison to any event in history that something like that happened. And struggling to find a comparison, I found only a relatively modern one. I know that not always we like to compare the modern to the ancient, but we don't have any other option. And the only one was actually when the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, the German one, was surrounded by the Red Army. And as we can see in this extract of one of the Russian NKVD officers told to one of his captured captive German officers that it was really interesting to know that some of those Soviet soldiers, even though they surrounded the Sixth Army, still surrendered to the Germans because they believed that the war will over with a German triumph. And the difference between the two, between those Soviet conscripts without good weapon or gear, training, experience, or even trust in their commander, is actually the best evidence why what we have seen in the siege of Jerusalem is not because of militarism, but because of the religion of those that have done the act. The Roman soldiers were professional. They had experience. They knew for certain that the city is surrounded. There was no reason for them to join the rebels unless really they felt that God may save the city or something of higher power. They knew exactly what the rebels are facing. They had the better equipment. There is no reason for them to do what they did unless they were Jewish, or at least they sympathized Judaism. And again, another important evidence from the period is this ostracon from Egypt. And what is really important about this ostracon, the date of 96 is not certain. Actually, there is a debate, but let's assume it's late first, early second, before the diaspora revolt. It's from Egypt. And in the original publication, it was suggested that what we are seeing is the Romans changing bread for wheat for Jews in order that they would make unleavened bread for Passover. This is one option. There's another option that this is because of the bread stamp that we have seen earlier. If it's bread and you have a bread stamp and you know that someone is not Jewish and the baker is not Jewish, some of the Jews in antiquity preferred to eat only food that was made by Jews. And that is a way for them to know, because most probably all the people serving in the Roman army in that area would know each other. And when you don't have another source to bring them the food, you just give them the wheat. Also, it's an easy option. The other thing is that the amount of food suggesting that we are talking about exactly 2 kutubernia, so 2 tenths. The number also shows that it's most probably soldiers. Furthermore, the person that is dealing with that is a Roman army officer. And for them to do something that needs to do something that is a lot of work, may be possible, or extra work, I fear that most probably because they actually those people have served in the army, and the Romans would care more about them. And this Ostracon is actually needs help us to reform our view of the Roman Empire, because if they'd done that for these Jews, they've most probably done that also for other Jews and for other occasions and for other things, but also most probably not only for Jews. And then we need to look at the other prison. The Roman army is the melting pot. It's the melting pot of the Roman Empire, and this is maybe part of the attempt to make the army accessible for everyone, because they needed the manpower and because they wanted it to be used to create one Roman identity, including to maybe groups that not always were as easy as others, like the Jews. And we have also other evidence from the time of the revolt. For example, we have this document that speaks about Termatos, a slave of Ananias, a centurion, in respect of the Jewish tax, which is a Jewish tax receipt from Egypt just before the diaspora revolt. And as only a freeman would have to pay, not a slave, most probably the owner of the slave, the centurion, is the Jewish person, and it's a good evidence even for Jews serving just a moment before this revolt. But again, Theo actually offers us another very interesting text, and this time it's from the second Jewish revolt. Many times we call it the Bar-Kokhba revolt, although we need to ask ourselves if it is a correct way to look at it. And in this extract, Dios says, so long indeed as Adrian was close by in Egypt and again in Syria, they remained quiet, save in so far as they purposefully made of poor quality such weapons as they were called upon to furnish, in order that the Romans might reject them, and they themselves might thus have the use of them. But when he went further away, they openly revolted. What we see here is that Jews were actually giving the opportunity to make weapons for the Roman army after the two previous revolts, just before the second Jewish revolt in Judea. And this showed that they still always trusted that most of the Jews are loyal. Also, if they gave them to make weapons, most probably they still gave them to serve in the army, as many of the other evidence shows us. But what is especially important is if you want to make thousands of weapons deemed unfit, you need assistance. And why is that? Because if you want to steal them and give them to the rebels or hide them, you need to get more iron ore to replace the one used for those blades, which means that you will have a very huge discrepancy between the amount of weapons that you are actually delivering to the army to the amount of materials that the army actually that you actually purchase. I mean, raw material. And the only way to actually make so many kilos or maybe tons of metal disappear is, and also of weapons, is that someone helped you. And most probably if he helped you, he was maybe Jewish, or at least sympathized the Jews. And so this is an incredible evidence for Jewish service at that period, because many officers and also people in the civil service most probably took part. And another one that is just the opposite is the evidence of Shimshon Cleisthenes from Caesarea, because it is from 157. And if he served for 25 years, that means that he was recruited at 132. And his unit was actually in Judea at 132 as part of the attempt to quell the second Jewish revolt. And this then a testimony to show that the Romans kept recruiting the Jews even during the revolt, even to replenish the casualties that happened to them or inflicted to them by the rebels. And it's an indication that for them, at least as long as a Jewish person took the military oath, then you could trust him. And so when we looking at everything, we need to understand that, yes, we have some evidence for Jewish soldiers and other Roman civil servants that turned against the Roman, but that doesn't mean that the Romans turned their view, the Jews were loyal. And the best evidence is that they'll keep recruiting them. And one of the major issues, and of course I don't have the time, I already think that I'm out of it, so I'll try to make it short, is that we have much more evidence for Jewish service just after the second Jewish revolt. Because not only did the Romans was still deeming the Jews as loyal as any other ruler throughout antiquity, also because the majority were loyal, or maybe this was also part of the Jewish identity that we still see in the form of neder throughout the centuries. That maybe also even the Jews that were against the empire or didn't like the presence of the empire have decided that after the second Jewish revolt, we need to align ourselves with it as long as the empire, of course, allow us. When the empires will become Christian in the 4th century, and especially after they would try to cast away the Jews at the beginning of the 5th, only then will we see a major decrease in evidence for Jewish service. And we need to see actually the Jewish service as the best evidence also that the majority of the Jews were always on the side of the Romans. And what we see in Judea is not necessarily what we need to, how do we need to look at Jewish communities in Rome or Syria or any other place. And also that Jews not necessarily resented as much as sometimes certain rabbinical texts show, or sometimes we think they were. And the Jews most probably were very different, as was also the Roman system that enabled anyone to serve. It was created in order that anyone would serve, and it was created in order to make everyone Romans. And the Jews, for the most part, were Romans throughout and throughout. Thank you so much for your time, really.
Thank you, Haggai, and we have 8 minutes per question.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I want to. You speak mainly about some evidence for the loyalty of Jews to the Roman Empire. I want to ask about the other side of this relation. To what extent is it something essential in Roman perception of nations within the empire, including nations that have a history of revolt, to reconcile or not to the word reconcile is not the right word, to maintain positive relations with the empire.
I think that it's more about what we need to. I'll try. I hope that I'm going to answer correctly or answer the question correctly. First of all, it's a question how important were the Jews in general, and we had so many estimates of how many Jews were in the Roman Empire. Everything from 5% to 20%. It's a question we don't really know. Anyhow, if it would be 5 or 10 or even 15, all of them would be major numbers, especially if we need to remember that there were so many groups in the Roman Empire. They can't just cast away every group that they don't like. Of course, that rulers in antiquity would usually prefer those that are more loyal, as long as they can actually recruit them and they can supply enough manpower. And if we've seen the Hellenistic period before, the Hellenistic rulers tried not to recruit the locals usually until they needed. They wanted the Macedonians, they wanted other Greeks, and they wanted the Jews. Why? Because it's groups from the outside, and also because usually they are well known in the military profession and they are loyal, and either as outsider or from other reasons. And they only recruited, for example, recruited the Egyptians only from the mid and late 3rd century BC because they had to. They didn't have enough of the 2 other groups, but they didn't want to. The Romans, I think it's the same problem, but we don't really see any other group or any group at all that are prevented from serving. Also, we don't really have exemption of any ethnic group. Those from the late republics for the Jews are the only ones that are from an ethnic group. And I think of at least according to the phrasing and also the disappearance and everything else, that they were not for all the Jews, not even in those provinces. They were part of the deal to not recruit some of the Jews in order that most of the community will be recruited. So
Yeah,
there are always
point.
maneuver with what you
Go back.
and at least for them, yes, some Jews done something bad, but this doesn't mean that the most did.
Stop.
And
Okay,
I think that also authors like Dio, when they put those testimonies, which are unique in not only in their text but in texts from antiquity, it's maybe because of their uniqueness, or from that they thought that this is important to mention, or others, or they tried to put something between the lines that was not necessarily was allowed for them to, by others to say, from different political internal reasons, including the relationship with the Jews.
Okay, we have time for another question. There is another question. Yes, one. Behind.
Lilith.
Thank you very much for a very interesting speech. I have one question related to the two parts. Togo insists that Jews were recruited in the Roman army, and the obvious parallel that arms have in mind immediately is the tragic story of Russian companies in the 19th century, the time of Nikolai I. And I would like to ask whether the parallel is exact. First, I didn't understand from what you have said, whether the recruitment was enforced or lieutenant, and the second was there also the enforcement of the religious practices and the state of Russian countries. You mentioned all this, but we know the text of military orders, even the text of the orders
with my PowerPoint, it doesn't seem to move. I'm not able to move it, and the lady says that it must be a full screen, short, small screen. I cannot move my own. Well, I'll show you in a minute. I cannot. I don't even see it. So let me just show you.
Okay, you have 2 minutes.
Right. First of all, this is a great question. If I was in the audience, I would put it, and also it enables me to fill in what I couldn't put in here in 20 minutes. And I'll try to fill in 2 minutes. The Russian case is certainly not what we see here, because in the Russian case, they forced Jews, especially young ones, into the army in order to make them not Jewish. They also baptized them when they recruited them. Nowhere in any text we have any Jews complaining about being forced into the army, or the service in the army preventing them to keep their religion. Furthermore, we have testimony, especially inscription, because we see an influx of inscriptions also, because maybe an influx in synagogue later on in the 4th and 5th century, that we have Jewish soldiers and officers that left inscriptions in the synagogues. We also have inscription of some Jews that had a very prominent position in the economy, synagogues, or like the head of the community and so on. And that's also a clear indication that they had no problem to keep being Jewish. Actually, one of the complaints of one of the Christian authors at the late 4th century is that the Jews are allowed to be everywhere, including in the army, but they, unlike anyone else, can, of course, this is already a Christian empire, can keep the religion even better than anyone else, and also doing their best to do so more than anyone else. And so his complaint showed that in general, at least until Jews were cast aside, they were able to keep at least the different practices that they choose to. Of course, every Jewish person kept his religious practices differently. They lived in something a bit different. We know that every 2 Jews need 3 synagogues, more or less. So I hope it answered. I hope that I don't know if we have the time for
You're down to about 20 seconds, so we're going to make do with that. And thank you for putting everything in perspective. People like me who came out of Land of Israel studies tend to look at things from the Land of Israel perspective, and we become Jewish-centric, which gives us sometimes a distorted view. And I think for me at least, you put things back into some type of a more interesting and normal perspective. Thank you very much. Okay, the last speaker is remote, so I want to find out how we're going to do this.
כן. חגית, תורך, את שומעת אותנו?
Just a second, כן, אני איתכם. בסדר, רק שנייה. אוקיי, אתם רואים את זה? אני אגב יכולה
לא
כנראה
שומעים,
להזיז. סטפני, אני יכולה להזיז
רגע,
כנראה
לא
את
שומעים.
המסך.
איפה נעלם האיש?
אני במסך הראשון.
לא, הוא נשאר פה עד...
יש תשלום נוסף אחרי 4.
רועי, אתה מסתכל אם הוא בחוץ? רועי? תנסי לדבר, נראה אם זה עובד.
אני מקווה, בוקר טוב. בוקר טוב מקנזס סיטי. שומעים? All right, can you hear me?
רגע, מחפשים את האיש של הסאונד.
What's the problem?
אם לא תדברי בוואטסאפ.
But what is the problem? I can't, you can't hear me? You can't hear me? No. Demetria?
נעשה את זה אחרת.
Demetria? You can't hear me, which never happened because I unmuted it. I unmuted
רגע, שנייה.
Yeah. I don't know. Speaker? Same system. Which never happened to me before, but because I did zillions of Zoom meetings.
I don't know.
Okay, let me go back. Hang on back. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
נעשה את זה בוואטסאפ. איפה המיקרופון?
Stephanie, I don't understand. It hasn't happened before, so I think we might as well skip it
תתקשרי אליי
altogether.
לוואטסאפ, אני פשוט אחבר אותך למיקרופון ככה.
בדיוק. כי פה הסאונד כן עובד.
אוקיי.
לא היו שומעים את הכל. הסאונד עובד פה.
I can see you. I can't see myself. Okay.
אז המיקרופונים עובדים על זה. פה אין את זה תלוי בלב.
What do you want me to do? All right, let's skip it. It's not going to work. Stephanie?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, Stephanie. Where are you? On the phone or on the Zoom? I can't hear you.
רגע, את שומעת אותי?
כן.
אני לא שומעת.
טוב, אין מה לעשות. I don't know. Can you hear me now?
עוד פעם?
כן, שומעת? Can you hear me? Okay, it's not working. Sorry, it's just not working, and I don't think it's right. Okay.
תתקשרי עוד פעם.
I can hear you, you can't hear me, can you? Okay, it's not going to work. Forget it. Okay, forget it. I can see my stuff, I cannot see, and it's not moving. Yeah, okay. Can you see the screen? Answer. It's never happened before. It's never happened before. I can hear you, you can't hear me. Can you?
אנחנו שומעים. לא יודעת איך נעשה את זה, אבל אנחנו שומעים. לא, מפה. רגע.
אז אותו דבר תצטרך להגיד מפה.
מדברת אליי? Are you talking to me? I'm on WhatsApp.
כן, נראה לי שעכשיו ככה אפשר לשמוע. את יכולה לדבר ככה מהוואטסאפ, אנחנו נשמע.
רק להתערב במערכת.
טוב, עד שבאתי, until Sivan started speaking, so I don't want to waste her time, so our last speaker is Sivan.
I think we might as well skip it.
Who is joining us remotely and will speak on where their God-fearers in late ancient Africa. Hagith, if you can hear me, you're on.
So forget it. I can't hear anything.
20 minutes lecture, 10 minutes questions. Should get out of the way.
כן, כן, אני בוואטסאפ ואני במסך ולא שומעים ולא, משהו לא בסדר, זה לא קרה לי קודם, מצטערת. כן, אני שומעת בוואטסאפ. אני לא שומעת אתכם. Sorry? But do you, בוואטסאפ או ב-actual computer? I'm sorry?
We hear you from the WhatsApp.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Talk.
Look, I think I have a problem. I cannot hear myself clearly, and I do not know whether you hear me clearly.
We hear you very well.
Okay, do you hear me via the WhatsApp or also via Zoom? Yes. Which one?
Only WhatsApp.
Okay. Can you try, do you want me, let me see if the screen, can you see my screen?
Yes, we see the screen.
I'm sorry?
We do see the screen.
Yes.
Can you see, is the screen moving?
No.
It's not moving? I think we'd better either skip it or try to reschedule for tomorrow. It's not, doesn't seem to work.
רגע, את מזיזה?
אני מזיזה, אתם רואים את ה... Do you see the screen? Do you see at all the first slide?
North Africa Red Smith.
So I guess you don't see the first slide because I have the first slide on my screen.
We also have the first one.
Okay, but you still cannot hear me. You need me to talk to the WhatsApp.
We hear you.
Okay, do you hear me via Zoom or via WhatsApp?
By WhatsApp.
Okay, fine, I got it. Okay.
So you need to keep everything like it is now, just try to move the PowerPoint so that we know that it works. Okay. No. I see it by my computer, but not here. היא מזיזה, אני רואה את זה פה, אבל זה לא עובר לי פה. רגע, שנייה. אני יודעת מה הבעיה, שנייה. עכשיו...
זה כמו סרט, דופליקייט.
עכשיו זה בסדר.
לשכפל תמונה.
אוקיי, זה אמור להיות בסדר. זה אצלה. אפשר.
Okay, can I start?
Yes.
Well, let me just tell you what my grandmother would have said. She would have said that digital technology is like sex. When it works, it's wonderful. When it does not work, it stinks. And that's, yeah. So I will try and be as brief as possible. Essentially taking you on a short adventure, which will be much shorter in view of the issues here. So what you're looking at is the oil lamp. I can't tell whether I'm being heard or not.
You're being heard.
All right, so this is an oil lamp that started my journey towards the heaven worshippers known as Kailikolai and the famous God-fearers of Asia Minor. This particular one it comes from North Africa. That's no doubt probably one of the workshop of Carthage. What is extremely interesting, and Peter can probably, hopefully corroborate, among the hundreds of examples of the menorah on oil lamps, this is the only one that shares the space with a human, or at least a human figure. There is simply no comparison whatsoever for this kind of combination. Now, many years ago, the great scholar Marcel Simon wrote 2 articles which are not particularly well known, in which he used this particular oil lamp in order to connect it with what he calls a Judeo. I'm sorry, I only hear background noises, and I cannot tell if I'm being heard or not. I'm sorry, I can't hear if I'm being heard or not. Why do I hear a lot of background noises? So that's the issue. Okay. So to make a long story short, Marcel Simon connected this particular oil lamp with a sect, probably from North Africa, in which he detected Phoenician elements, pagan elements, and Jewish elements, and even 1 or 2 Christian elements. The Christian elements were striking because as the next slide will show you, the only time the only time that you do have this combination of human figure is on this oil lamp. We only have the drawing. It does also come from North Africa, the area of Carthage. So these are 2 extremely interesting examples. I thought that Marcel Simon had wonderful ideas, but I did not agree with his interpretation, which I interpreted in a different framework. What I did think is that it is time to reconsider the group which is called the Calicoli. Now, quickly overview of the sources that we have that mention this particular group by its name. We don't know if it's the name given by the group itself or the name given by the observers. So surprisingly, this particular group appears in one of the imperial laws issues relating to quote-unquote heresies. And it comes in the good company of the Donatists, the Manichees, the Priscillians, and the pagans. So surprisingly, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this particular group emerges with its own structure, edificia, perhaps, or even sanctuaries. And it also, the emperor emphasizes that he has absolutely no clue what they're doing and what is their dogma. So basically, this very short allusion to the Calicoli in the company of very well-known so-called heretical groups. So this is the first appearance, which is in 407 CE. The next time, the emperor in another law dedicates an entire law to the Calicoli. And if you could read it many, many times, and you will still have absolutely no clue what actually are they all about. In other words, what do they do? What do they actually, how do they operate? How do you detect them? In other words, what is their ID? What is the DNA? All you can see from this is that they are considered Jewish, Christian. In other words, the basic target of the law is the agents of conversions, those Jews who supposedly forcibly compel Christians, what they call to adopt the foul and degrading name of the Jews, which incidentally connects this particular presentation to the one delivered on Manetho, showing that calling Jews in various lovely names is a very, very old tradition, which in late antiquity has been readopted with vigor by the imperial legislation. So we have 2 laws that deal with the Calicoli. We don't learn much about them beyond the fact that they were originally Christians, and that clearly the imperial court saw them with great disfavor. Next, we actually have two lines from, I just want to say that the second law, the very long one, is addressed to the Comes Africae. In other words, here is an absolutely clear connection with the African provinces in late antiquity. The next one comes from no more no less St. Augustine. In one of the letters, letter 44, which has nothing to do with Calicoli, again they appear out of nowhere, in which he says, because of the necessity of ordaining a bishop was already tearing us away from here, we could not stay with him, namely the local bishop, much longer, for we had already sent a letter, presumably, to the head of the worshippers of heaven, who had constituted a new baptism among them, leading away many astray by sacrilege. Okay, so now we have something more concrete. What we do know now, that the officials or official of the Calicola was called Major Calicolae. And this in itself already suggests Jewish connection because, as other scholars have shown, this particular title of Major seems to be seems to relate exclusively to Jewish officials. We also notice that there is a reference to baptism, which is extremely interesting, as though the Calicola resorted to a new kind of immersion or baptism, which for Augustine constitutes a sacrilege, which is a word lavishly applied to everybody that you didn't like. So what can we say about the Calicola based on Augustine and on the imperial laws? So imperial laws indicate the novelty of the sect, at least in Western court circle, while Augustine highlights the novelty of their baptism in Africa, both texts acknowledging the sect's growing popularity. Number two, for Augustine, the apparent perversity of Calicolan baptism was the main issue at stake. The law dwelt on the sect's affinity with Judaism. The Calicola, who ignited imperial wrath, hailed from the very heart of Christian orthodoxy. Number four, as a group, the Calicola met in specific venues, aedifecia, where they gathered, conventus, to acquire the rudiments or the knowledge of a new dogma, dogma nova, likely under the guidance of an elder, namely, or elders, namely Major or Majores Calicola, who may have also acted as agents of conversion. Overall, the Calicola, God-fearers, heaven-fearers, are they the same as the God-fearers? Now, according to Amnon Linde already years ago in his absolutely masterpiece, The Jews in the Roman Imperial Legislation, when he translated the two imperial laws that I mentioned, he used the term God-fearers, which immediately should ignite the attention of anybody who ever looked at the history of the Jewish communities in Asia Minor. Because in Asia Minor, God-fearers run around. And not only in Asia Minor, but this is exclusively in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. So the most notable inscriptions, and the only inscriptions relating to God-fearers, come from Asia Minor. Now, if this is correct, in other words, the African Calicola are the same as the God-fearers as Amnon assumed, then the equation, number one, will provide concrete evidence regarding the ways in which Gentiles, namely non-Jews in general, were integrated into provincial Jewishness. It will explain the horizons of Judaized Gentiles, pagan Christians, beyond the borders of the eastern provinces. The precise dating available for the Calicola, which is the last decade of the 4th century and the first decade of the 5th century, has the potential of bolstering the redating of the most famous God-fearers inscription, the Aphrodisias list, originally dated to the early 3rd century, more recently to the 4th or even 5th. In other words, there's no precise dating at all. So, If correct, again, the equation between the Kalikola and God-fearers will provide concrete evidence regarding the ways in which Gentiles, specifically Christians, were integrated into provincial Jewishness, and it will explain the rises of Judaized Gentiles. Moreover, the precise dating, again, has the potential of bolstering redating of the Aphrodisias lists. So, let's move from North Africa, Asia Minor, and to Aphrodisias with its rather famous inscription. And you can see there are, by the way, excellent photographs available online. So this is now in the museum of Warsaw because the inscription was actually unearthed out of the museum when it underwent remodeling. So you can see that there are two sides, inscribed two sides, and perhaps you can see that this particular side has two separate inscriptions with a little hiatus in the middle, and this one has another inscription, both of them obviously on the same stone. So this is the one side of the stone, which has the two lists. These are essentially lists, and the next one is the other side of the stone. And unfortunately, the top is gone, which is really a problem. And this is the other side, so it's in a sense a third list. So there have been countless discussions of the interpretation and meaning of the list. Just to give you an idea of what it says, this is not my translation. God help us. Oh, with the help of God. Donors to the soup kitchen. Below are listed the members of the decany of the students of the law, I should say the learners, but never mind, also known, just a second, also known as those, oh, hang on a second, we're just trying to get it in the middle, as those who fervently praise God, who erected for the relief of suffering in the community at their personal expense this memorial building. And here are the names: Yael, Prostates, her or his son Joshua, magistrate; Theodotus, former palace employee; son Hilarionis. So what you have is the names of individuals who, at least in this section, donated to perhaps a soup kitchen, some sort of charity, and each one comes with some sort of qualification, whether it's the job, whether it's their function, like psalm singers, something like good-tempered, a God-fearer, of course, which is why we're looking at it. And then sometimes it would just tell you X son of Y. And now the next part of the inscription is simply a list of names. Again, just a list of names, presumably relating to the upper part of this inscription. The other, so again, you could see names, and Xenon, Tertullus, Diogenes, and so forth and so on.
חכי שנייה, זה התנתק.
Okay? Okay, so basically, did you lose me in Aphrodisias or in North Africa? Did you lose me in Aphrodisias or in North Africa?
Yes.
I'm sorry?
Half a minute ago.
No. Yes. תמשיכי מפה שדל.
Okay. Did you lose me in Aphrodisias or in North Africa?
Yes. In the first one.
In the Aphrodisias?
Yes.
Fine. So essentially, if anybody had a chance to look at the inscriptions, I really highly recommend, because both they're excellent photographs, and there are all kinds of translations, both the original text in Greek, of course, and translations available, and you will find that one translation differs from the other in some important respects. The bottom line is that the inscriptions have been dated by the original spectacular, fantastic publication of Joyce Reynolds, and and Dr. Tenenbaum, in which they assert that all the inscriptions belong to the early 3rd century. More recently, based primarily on paleography, it has been suggested that there are actually 2 distinct inscriptions, one of them dating to the early 3rd century, but the other part could date to as late as the 4th century and the early 5th century, which of course brings us to the Kali Kola. In no examination could anybody offer precise dating for the inscription, other than early 3rd, late 4th, early 5th. So here's one major distinction and one major reason why the Kali Kola and the God-fearers of Aphrodisias could be considered side by side with some sort of insights. So, in Aphrodisias, the God-fearers of various persuasions, professions, and inclination appear to have populated the eastern provinces. But invariably they appear singly. Only in Aphrodisias, an entire group, or actually groups of God-fearers, each one carefully named, appear in conjunction with donation, perhaps to the synagogue, perhaps to the community. It's not actually clear. Then the Aphrodisias lists stand out precisely because they contain 2 consolidated registers and not an epigraphic record of an isolated individual or 2. The rarity in Jewish epigraphic annals of such a record in conjunction with a specific charitable undertaking can be fully appreciated when compared with 315 lists of Jewish benefactors and beneficiaries from the Geniza. There's only one parallel in antiquity at a distance of some 4 centuries of consolidated lists. And this is the Berenice, the North African, the Cyrene inscription of 55 CE that records details of communal charity exactly as you would expect it to be recorded, namely precise date, which is absent from Aphrodisias, the issuing body, which is not very clear in Aphrodisias, the reason for the erection, which is stated in Aphrodisias, and a list of donors, each with patronym with the amount donated. We do not have the amount stated in Aphrodisias. Even so, these are the 2 lists surviving the entire span of Jewish antiquity. So, what can we say? The sudden materialization in Aphrodisias of a group of urbanites united around learning, prayer, and charity echoes the unexpected intrusion of the Kali Kolai, a group likewise, an assembly focusing on learning and implementing the tenets of Judaism into Augustinian and imperial orbits. The imperial legislator made no distinction, as did contemporary theologians, between sympathizers, Judaizers like God-fearers, Kali Kola, who were devoted to learning, prayer, and charity, and full converts who undergone both circumcision and immersion. This is an important point because whenever you talk about conversion to Judaism, which has been a perennial topic of interest, one should notice that exterior sources like imperial law do not distinguish between fully converts and partial converts, if you want to call them. No laws issued in the eastern provinces employs, sorry, it's a mistake, Jews or God-fearer to combat the threat posed by non-orthodoxy. In other words, there are no laws issued to magistrates of the imperial provinces or from the court of Constantinople that actually relates at all or mentions Jews or God-fearers in the context of heresy and non-orthodoxy. So the question, were God-fearers as conspicuous as they appear in Jewish epigraphical annals of late antiquity, and I should say in modern scholarship, has their presence been blown out of proportion to its true extent? So, around 900 CE, the compilers of the Emperor Leo's Basilica copied and edited the 2 imperial constitutions of Honorius relating to the Kali Kolai. Leo's lawyers named them correctly as heaven worshippers, using the word Sebestai, that harkened back to the Theosebes of Aphrodisias. Can we then draw a direct line from the God-fearers Aphrodisiacs to the Kalikola in Africa, all the way to the 6th and even 9th century, where this belated repetition of Honorius' two laws denote an act of memorialization or the survival of God-fearing Judaizers well beyond late antiquity? Did we deem the disappearance of God-fearers in the 3rd century to have been announced prematurely? So I end up, thank you, and with a series of questions. I can only offer speculations by way of answer, but I would think that in this point, it makes sense to ask the questions. And I apologize about all these technical issues. We have tried our best, and I'm very grateful to Stephanie for acting heroically in these matters. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's okay, it's no big deal. Yeah. Yes, okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Here.